Good afternoon. Randall Law is curator at the Southern Museum of Flight, where he manages a collection that celebrates the past, present, and future of military and general aviation in Alabama and across the South. He's professor emeritus of history from Birmingham Southern, where he won several teaching and research awards during a 20-year career. And he's going to come back and still teach this fall. Randy earned a BA in Russian from Amherst, a master's in Russian and Eastern European history from Yale University, and a PhD in Russian and European history from Georgetown. He is a master teacher. He is an expert on the history of Russia, Ukraine, the Soviet Union, and the Cold War, and is an internationally recognized scholar in the history of terrorism. In 2009, he spent 4 months in Odessa as a Fulbright research scholar. He is frequently interviewed by reporters on an international and national basis related to terrorism, Russian politics, and history. When this mess broke out, we did a campus forum at 2 o'clock in the afternoon for students and faculty, standing room only, and I saw not one single kid on his or her phone. That evening, we repeated that as a Zoom that was open to our alumni and the community, and we had more than 500 people sign on. He knows what he's talking about. He's going to tell us about some things today that are hard to know, but we will leave knowing more. My friend Randy Law.
Good afternoon. I had to check my watch. I very much appreciate the invitation to come and speak to you all. I'm friends with several people here, and I know the good work that Kiwanis does in Birmingham. So it's a real pleasure for me to be here, and thank you to my friend Virginia for the very kind introduction. So I'm going to be talking about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I opted not to use PowerPoints, which was kind of hard for this historian. I figured that if I had PowerPoints, it would be an hour later and we wouldn't have left the 17th century with the maps and the images and the paintings and the icons. So, so I'm going to try to keep myself on track and actually not talk too much about history, but talk more about how history in some ways has shaped the present and the significance of the war in Ukraine. So I will not beat around the bush at all. The cause of this war is Russian imperial aggression, or to use a narrower term, revanchism. Russia under Putin seeks to reassert its old power and to exert control either directly or indirectly over territory that it has controlled not just as the Soviet Union, but as the Russian Empire going back centuries. Let me get a glass of water. Excellent. So, the Russian state, based in Moscow since the 15th century or so, has always been imperial in character. And it's not just been imperial in terms of geopolitical aspirations, but it has claimed a God-given mandate to dominate a vast sweep of territory in Eurasia. And given the large size, the population, the territorial significance of Ukraine, domination of the Ukrainians has always been a key aspect, really the linchpin of Russian imperial identity going back centuries. Russia has always essentially denied Russian leadership in its culture, among its elite, and at a common level in Russia. Russians have always effectively denied Ukraine's existence as a separate state, the Ukrainian people as a separate nation, the Ukrainian language, Ukrainian culture as distinct entities. And there has been a centuries-long history of forced attempts by Russia and the Russian elite to Russifize Ukrainians and to trivialize its people. This is a Russian imperial behavior, and it was adopted with some changes, but in general, a straight line can be drawn through the 20th century and how the Soviet Union treated Ukraine and the Ukrainians. In this way, the USSR, the Soviet Union, it inherited this attitude and continued it. And we see that right up to now in the post-Soviet period and in the 21st century. I wanted right off the bat to spell what I regard as a red herring, which is that we're often told that the West, the United States in particular, but the West in general, is somehow responsible for the Russian invasion of Ukraine because of the eastward expansion of NATO after the end of the Cold War. We need to be clear. The primary impulse for the eastward expansion of NATO really came not from the United States, but came from the peoples, the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, who had far more experience, far more personal experience than the United States did over centuries of dealing with Russian imperial aggression. In particular, of course, in recent memory, for some at least, I guess, the construction of the Soviet bloc at the beginning of the Cold War. So therefore, it was natural and utterly predictable for those countries, the people of Poland, of Hungary, particularly of the Baltic states, who had been repeatedly invaded by Russians and Soviets to seek protection from NATO. And as if we needed the reminder of it, outside of what has happened in Ukraine, Russia has proven over and over again since the end of the Cold War that it's still, after the period of humiliation in the 1990s, Russia and leading Russians still fully embrace their imperial identity. Russia, post-Soviet Russia, has intervened in or invaded or sought to influence by hook or by crook many of its former Soviet republics throughout the Caucasus, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, in Central Asia, and in particular, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And now Ukraine, not once, but twice. In short, Russia constitutes an existential threat to its neighbors, and its neighbors have responded quite appropriately, quite naturally, as they sought the mantle of protection of an expanding NATO. Putin says that Russia, Vladimir Putin, president of Russia, says that Russia is essentially fighting a war against the West, a war against the US, a war against NATO. This only makes sense, given that background, if Russia and Putin deny any autonomy, any autonomous decision-making to Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. This only makes sense as an explanation if Putin and the Russians denied the ability of Ukrainians to chart their own course. And so this gets to the real reason for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The post-Cold War history of Ukraine is really quite a remarkable thing. In recent decades, Ukrainians have made it very clear, whether Russian speakers from the East, Ukrainian speakers from the West, people who are Orthodox, Catholic, Jewish, whatever their background might be, they have made it very clear in recent decades that they, as Ukrainians, want to live in a free, in a pluralistic, and in a sovereign Ukraine that is part of Europe and the world. Ukrainians say with a very loud and very strong voice now that they, and Ukraine, is a part of the West. And that very widespread belief is a direct threat, not only to Russia's self-conception as an empire, as a great power. But also, it's a direct threat to Putin's dream of reconstituting a greater Russia. Ukraine fundamentally threatens Putin's authoritarian hold on Russia because if left unchallenged, Ukrainians, because of all the cross-border connections between family and friends, professionals, culturally between Russians and Ukrainians, if left unchallenged, Ukrainians really pose a threat. They're likely to infect their neighbor Russia with notions of multi-party elections, the rule of law, free media, and a global citizenship. And so that really gets to the heart of Putin's driving, his rationale that has driven this decision to invade Ukraine. So I'm not going to recapitulate the war. I'll make reference to a few things as we go along, a few developments. I want to talk more broadly about what do we make of the invasion? What is its impact right now in the region and beyond? We obviously have to start with Ukraine and the Ukrainians. Ukraine, we can talk about the geopolitics of this all we want. We can talk about the funding that keeps the Ukrainians in the fight. But we always have to remember who has the most at stake here. And that is Ukraine and the Ukrainians. Ukraine survived the initial invasion in February and March of 2022. How did they do this? How did they achieve this? Of course, from the beginning, Ukrainians understood that they were fighting for their continued existence as a free people. And so they have responded accordingly. They're fighting for their national survival. Also, we have to remember that this war did not begin for the Ukrainians in February 2022. It began in the spring of 2014 when Russia fomented separatist movements in the Donbass, in eastern Ukraine, and then invaded and annexed Crimea in the spring of that year. Ukrainians have considered themselves at war for the last 9 years, not the last year and change. They've been waiting for the other shoe to fall in many regards. They've been preparing for it, even as through the late teens, even into 2021, 2022, Ukrainians were trying to live their own life. They were preparing for what they always assumed would come next, which was some sort of use of force by Putin and Russia. In those years, Ukrainians went ahead with new efforts to modernize the economy, to adopt a host of legal and political reforms, and in general, via trade, culture, travel, international agreements to draw closer to the West. But in particular, they modernized their military. In 2014, the Ukrainian military was a pretty sorry affair. In 2014, the Ukrainian military was still essentially a Soviet-style military. But with lots of aid, primarily from the United States and the United Kingdom, the Ukrainians retrained their military as a NATO-style force. And this was not only in terms of organization and equipment. A really important part of what the Ukrainians did during those years, and one of the things that really has meant their survival, was that the Ukrainian military completely rethought how to operate. They embarked on a sophisticated program of teaching and training the enlisted and the NCOs in the Ukrainian military to lead and act on their own initiative. And we've seen that in the last year and a half or so. This is the Ukrainian military that repelled the initial Russian advance on Kyiv, and that since the fall, then with a pause, and then again now has gone on the offensive itself. The United States, Britain, and their NATO and EU allies have, of course, given a lot of aid, military, financial, and humanitarian aid. It's hard to come up with good numbers, but it certainly exceeds $200 billion in total, maybe even as much as 220 or $230 billion, really going back to 2014, not just to 2022. The United States has probably given about half of that total. So while it's the Ukrainians who are fighting and who are dying, it's the global community, particularly the United States and its NATO partners, that have kept the Ukrainians in the fight. Obviously, another reason the Russian invasion failed to topple the Ukrainian leadership and to seize Kyiv and to knock Ukraine out of the war has a lot to do with the Russians and the Russian military. With the very poor state of not just the Russian military, but the Russian economy and society, as well as really fundamental weaknesses in terms of its military and civilian leadership. The war has really revealed just how much Ukraine has changed, and not just since 1991, but even just in the last decade, and how little Russia has changed. Russia, we all know this to a certain degree, Russia is, under Putin, is an authoritarian state. One in which there's effectively one leader, one party, non-competitive elections, no independent judiciary, very little free media in Russia today, and in many ways, effectively, no rule of law. But it goes beyond this. Russia today is effectively a vast criminal enterprise in which political leaders work in conjunction with billionaires, and then in particularly with the military-industrial complex. And the leaders of Russia essentially see the state as a means to enrich themselves in a situation in which they get to write the rules. I think it's better to think of Russia today as a large mafia enterprise rather than simply a sovereign state. And one of the facts of this is that military contracts are a fantastic way for the elite of Russia to siphon money from the state. So the poor performance of the Russian military has everything to do with this context. Despite all the money spent to modernize the Russian military, much of the money simply vanishes into thin air, into the pockets of the Russian political and economic elite. There's another element to this. In many ways, Vladimir Putin is reaping what he has sown. He rules via a sort of social compact in the Russian Federation, in which common folk are encouraged to become politically apathetic, disengaged from the workings, the political culture of the state, in return for economic stability and a measure being able to once again claim citizenship in a great power. He has Putin, in his 2+ decades since coming to power, has invested a lot of time and treasure in stoking grievances and presenting a picture of Russia as an aggrieved, persecuted country that was biding its time to be able to, in essence, reassert itself and wreak its vengeance on those who had humiliated it going back decades. Which means that this political apathy, which is widespread in Russia, means that while the war is nominally supported, there's not a whole lot of popular zeal for the war. And what there is manufactured, given that this is a propaganda state. Meanwhile, the Russian military remains, in many ways, essentially Soviet. not just in the equipment that they use and the way that the military is organized, but in terms of leadership. Remember what I said about how Ukraine modernized. It is meant to fight as a NATO force with a lot of devolved responsibility, particularly to the NCOs, which means it's a force that can react when things go wrong. The Russian, as the Soviet military before it, is a conscript army with horrible morale. It is poorly paid. It is designed to succeed and really only capable of succeeding when it faces a weak enemy, has overwhelming firepower, and deploys its officers, its high-ranking officers, forward to support some command and control, which explains why the casualty rate among the Russian military leadership in the Ukrainian war is so high, because if they want to keep the troops moving forward, if they want to coordinate them, they have to send colonels and generals into the front lines. Makes it sound like it's, Bannister Tarleton at the Battle of Cowpens or something like this, not a modern army relying on its troops to fight as trained. We can learn a little bit about what happened with the Wagner uprising, staged just last month by its leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin. Prigozhin, by the way, is a fascinating and utterly bizarre character. He began as a chef and a caterer. He became Putin's caterer. He grew into a millionaire, then a billionaire, and then he got into the mercenary business. You couldn't make this up. The Wagner Group is and by the way, it's called the Wagner Group, after Richard Wagner, the German composer. And so right down to its roots, this private military corporation is infected with a kind of rabid nationalism and only probably a thinly veiled anti-Semitism as well. So the Wagner Group, it's been effective because its soldiers are well armed, relatively well trained and well paid. Prigozhin used his wealth and his unit's effectiveness as a platform to try to make his claim for a more prominent status politically speaking. He's already fabulously wealthy. Prigozhin also used the success of his unit as a platform to denounce, not just in strong language, but in crude prison language, to denounce much of the Russian high command. And so early in June, when Prigozhin's mercenaries were told that they would have to sign up with the Russian military, they would essentially have to join the military if they were going to continue to fight and be paid. This meant that the state was going to finally begin to crack down on Prigozhin and the Wagner Group as a loose cannon. Wagner was effectively going to be disabled. Prigozhin, like Putin, operates in an echo chamber. He surrounds himself with sycophants. This is what authoritarians do. Nobody pops up to say, that's a bad idea. How are you going to get from A to Z, really? They're surrounded by people who are paid, who are invested in endorsing whatever cockamamie idea comes down the pike. Prigozhin and his commanders, those around him, probably thought that they had a lot of support, particularly within the military, complaining about how the invasion of Ukraine was being carried out. Probably, we don't know. We're going to find out more information along the way, I'm sure. Prigozhin seems to have decided to use his leverage to stage a mutiny, maybe not to actually overthrow the state, but probably to use it to remake the Russian military and to take an even larger commanding role in Russian politics while protecting the sanctity of the Wagner Group. When it didn't materialize, Prigozhin seized the olive branch that Putin offered. The really interesting question, of course, in this is not just how do we get this? How do we get to this mutinous activity? But where does this leave Vladimir Putin in the wake of it? This was a full-fledged act of treason. The Wagner troops pulled out of the Eastern Front, out of Bakhmut, seized a large southern Russian city, Rostov-on-Don, seized a military headquarters, arrested a number of senior Russian military officials, started to march on on Moscow. And then when the Russian military reacted, it's documented that they shot down at least 7 Russian aircraft, killing an undetermined number of Russian pilots. And meanwhile, as this was happening, Putin denounced him in very strong terms, and now seems to have tried to move on. It's hard to interpret this. It's a very strange response on Putin's behalf. It would seem that Putin's muted response suggests that he understands that he's feeling quite weak, that he can't overplay his hand too much. He understands that he is vulnerable. You would expect a dictator, an authoritarian, to use a much more forceful response against this kind of treasonous behavior. It's interesting. Putin doesn't fear the public. He has destroyed all opportunities for organized resistance. He has destroyed civil society in that sense. Putin doesn't fear the public. The only place that could spawn the kind of challenge that could be successful would be the military-industrial complex, the billionaire oligarchs, the military or the security forces, as they're called in Russian, the siloviki, the strongmen, essentially. I want to talk for a moment about NATO and the significance of this conflict for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The great irony here, of course, is that if Putin launched his war against Ukraine to push back the West, in particular to push back NATO, to decouple Ukraine from NATO and the West, he has managed to accomplish exactly the opposite in really stunning fashion. NATO is often described as the most successful military alliance in history, in that it bound together the United States, Canada, and Western Europe, and helped deter direct aggression from the Soviet Union for over 40 years. But while NATO expanded from 16 countries at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union to 30 by last year, it had become increasingly unclear what the purpose of NATO was after the collapse of the Soviet Union. If NATO was primarily a military alliance, the obvious question, of course, was who was NATO protecting us from? Just a few years ago, Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, declared that NATO was experiencing what he called brain death, that it had a lack of purpose. Why did NATO exist? And that was actually a pretty good question as recently as just a few years ago. Well, NATO very clearly has a purpose now to protect Europe and North America from Russian revanchism and military aggression. It has so clearly re-exerted itself and proven its purpose and demonstrated its military value that Sweden and Finland, 2 countries that tried to remain neutral during the Cold War and for the decades after the end of the Cold War, very quickly applied for membership right after the invasion. Finland has joined NATO, and in some really stunning developments just last week, the obstacles to Sweden's accession to NATO have been removed. The joining of Finland to NATO is quite remarkable. Finland has a small population, has a small military, but it is absolutely top tier in terms of its training, its equipment, and its capabilities. So the joining of Finland is a tremendous asset to NATO. It also expands NATO's borders with Russia, which of course is is far more significant from the Russian side. Before that, just 2 years ago, NATO had about a 750-mile border with Russia, the Baltics, and around Kaliningrad, to almost 1,600 miles with the joining of Finland. NATO's newfound purpose is coming out in more ways than just a heightened military capability, and with the coordinated contributions to Ukraine's defense. Germany, Poland, and the Baltic states have dramatically increased their defense spending. More of that looms on the horizon, and the alliance as a whole has shifted troops to its eastern front, with Russia as well as in Poland and Hungary. And more than it has in decades, NATO is speaking strongly and with one voice about the values its members share. NATO is once again showing that it's not just, it never was just a political, just a military alliance. It was an alliance with great geopolitical import, and it was a way to amplify the values that the members of NATO have shared. Another stunning development, as I mentioned here, with the obstacles to Sweden's accession falling away. This is because Turkey has dropped its effort to block Sweden joining NATO. And it happened really very quite quickly last week. It's hard to make sense of this. Fully, Turkey is a semi-democratic state, although it really in many ways showed that it's probably a more democratic state than it was believed to be in the West, because of the elections that Erdogan narrowly won, which probably also plays a role in Turkey's decision to accept Sweden's accession to NATO. It would seem to indicate Erdogan and Turkey have tried to play both sides of this fence in terms of economic ties and geopolitical ties between Russia and its NATO allies. This would seem to indicate that Turkey now understands that its future lies much more with Europe than with Russia. Maybe the most stunning development that came out of the NATO summit last week was an announcement of a new raft of defense arrangements with Ukraine. Non-binding, but significant bilateral agreements between NATO and Ukraine, and hints that were not being supplied weeks, months, years ago, that after this war is over, Ukrainian membership in NATO is very much on the table. Moving on to China. This is, of course, one of the bigger questions. I want to make very clear I'm not a China expert. I know a lot about Russia, Ukraine, NATO. China is outside of my wheelhouse, but it's pretty clear if we pay attention what the implications are. Some of the most important things going on here. What I was struck with from the beginning was the closing relationship between Russia and China is interesting because these are two authoritarian states. Authoritarian regimes can be much more comfortable with each other than they can be with open and democratic states. Authoritarian leaders, authoritarian elite know that their relationship is entirely transactional. They know what they are in it for. And they also know that neither party is going to make a stink at all about niceties such as the rule of law or human rights or democracy. This was an alliance, a relationship between China and Russia that was entirely forged on self-interest and not really necessarily on a congruence of values or even agendas. I, of course, think back to the non-aggression pact signed between Hitler and Stalin in 1939, utterly transactional. Both sides entered into that relationship, doing so entirely out of that kind of self-interest. I don't think, though, that China got what it bargained for in this relationship. China wants stability, they want respectability, and they want increased global influence. A marriage with Russia offers none of those things. A marriage with Russia is bad for one's brand. If you're trying to project stability, if you're trying to project respectability, if you're trying to grow your influence among third parties, Russia is not the poster child of any of those things. So while the relationship still exists, I think that also helps to explain some of the general coolness of China in recent months. Okay, I want to end by doing something that's very uncomfortable for a historian. I want to look into the future a bit more, take some tentative steps onto thin ice for a historian and not speak about the past, but speak about some of the options for the future, or at least how the past, how the history and what we know now is going to lay out some options. I'll start where I just finished, which is China. If there are ways in which the Russian brand is bad for China, there are also still things about the relationship with Russia that are very, very attractive to China. And these things give China a stake in a protracted war, and even more so with a Russian victory. First, the Russian invasion of Ukraine distracts the world, particularly the United States, from China's activity around the globe, particularly, of course, in the East China Sea. Second, US, British, European Union support for Ukraine offers the possibility of a destabilizing drain on resources, not just attention, but money and talent as well. The third one is the big one, though. If Russia wins, and it's worth, as a parenthetical, explaining what do we mean by Russian victory here. Not just we wouldn't want to narrowly define a Russian victory in terms of being able to seize the initiative again and seizing Kyiv, but rather a negotiated settlement that leaves Russia with a large amount of Ukrainian territory, a settlement that requires a lot of Ukrainian territorial concessions would be seen as a Russian victory. Such a victory, as far as the Chinese are concerned, would really dramatically undercut American prestige. It would dramatically undercut the cohesiveness of Europe that has been on display in the last year and a half. And it would undercut the global respect for the rule of law and modern sovereignty. In other words, from China's perspective, a Russian victory virtually gives China a green light to increase its pressure on Taiwan up to and including invasion. As far as the Chinese are concerned, if the United States can't protect Ukraine from Russia, China will likely ask, will the United States protect Taiwan from China? A Russian victory in Ukraine severely threatens Europe as well, because it would embolden Vladimir Putin. Putin, as I said earlier, has made his intentions clear since he came to power over 2 decades ago. He wants to reestablish Russian regional hegemony and reassert its influence over its former possessions in the Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe in the Soviet bloc, either through direct territorial absorption or into indirect means of economic coercion, or instability through what are called frozen conflicts, which is what we see in Moldova and the Caucasus. Putin has shown that he is really proven that he is willing to keep doing that until he is stopped. And it's right now the Ukrainians who are stopping him. If Ukraine loses this war, Putin would likely threaten the Baltic states, Poland, and our other allies in Central and Eastern Europe. If Ukraine loses, Putin will obviously not respect NATO as a deterrent to more aggression. And that, of course, carries with it the increased danger of a direct war between the United States and Russia. I've talked the most about the consequences of a Russian victory for the United States in terms of China and NATO. And those, I want to be very clear, those consequences I believe would be catastrophic. This is enough of a reason to support Ukraine until victory. And that's frankly how we should make our decisions. We should make our decisions as a country, as a nation, as a people, concerning our foreign policy and our foreign policy dollars out of self-interest. Foreign aid is not charity. Foreign aid is not philanthropy. Countries give money, whether it's humanitarian, military, or financial, to further their own interests. In giving money and supporting Ukraine, we are furthering American interests. But we really do need to remember, we do not want to lose sight of what is really fundamentally going on here in Ukraine. And so I want to end by foregrounding once again Ukraine and Ukrainian sacrifice. Ukrainians are fighting a just war to safeguard their independence. Ukrainians want to pursue a future that I think Americans would find utterly recognizable and hold dear. Ukrainians want a future based on freedom, based on pluralism, based on democracy, based on the rule of law, and based on participation in a global economy and society. And for that reason, in addition to the other ones, I believe that Ukraine very much deserves our unwavering help until victory. I'm going to stop there. I am happy to take any questions that anybody has on this topic and answer them to the best of my ability.
I don't think I heard you say one thing Putin was lying. And given the fact that I'm sure all of your opinions and analysis are in the public domain, does that put you personally at risk?
Person at risk by being killed by plutonium. I think in the grand scheme of things, the global hierarchy, I'm pretty far down the list. There's a huge community of Americans who support Ukraine, who have extensive experience traveling in Ukraine, far more than I do, and they're nearly of one mind in their interpretation of Russia, Putin, and the war in Ukraine. So to be honest, that hadn't crossed my mind. Yes, thank you.
Is there any intelligence that Russia and China are collaborating with regard to Ukraine, how the United States up in different parts of the world? And if so, do we have the resources?
Well, we do, helping Ukraine win. A Ukrainian victory is the most important thing to be done there while maintaining ready resources elsewhere. I don't know. There's I'm sure there is intelligence. I'm not privy to it. There is a lot of evidence that this, at the moment, seems to be more of a rhetorical alliance. There are some substantive elements there. I mean, there's been evidence of Chinese microchips showing up in munitions and weaponry in Ukraine. This is one of the things that early on was done to try to punish Russia, was to essentially cut it off from the global markets and global trade. And this is one of the things that had hit home the most, was cutting Russia off from high-tech imports, because they don't have the industry at home to manufacture these weapons and the computer circuitry and the components for it. So there's some evidence that China is helping out on that front. I think I didn't mention it here, another real loophole, another weakness of the sanction regime is India. The United States and its allies shut off Russian participation in a lot of the global economy, in particular energy, and it's petrodollars that kept the Russian economy afloat for decades, even actually going back to the end of the Soviet Union. And so the United States and its Western allies and elsewhere are not buying Russian oil and Russian natural gas, but India is now buying 7 times the energy that it did beforehand. So I think it's that other countries in addition to China can supply as much as it is equipment.
So that'll be the last question.
Okay.
We know that the Ukrainians took out a strategic bridge from Russia to the Crimea.
The Kerch Straits, right?
In retaliation, apparently Russia last night bombarded Odessa. I wish you could comment on the import of Russia's rescission of the agreement to allow wheat to go through the Black Sea to Africa and the countries that need wheat.
Yeah.
Has the United States indicated that with escort would provide its destroyers to escort those vessels out of the Black Sea and into the Mediterranean?
I don't know. I'm not well versed enough in those details. This is another major consequence of this war: food insecurity around the globe. Ukraine is a massive exporter of wheat and other grains, and of course, it's a financial lifeline for Ukraine now as well. The Russians have a long history, of course, of playing, of using economic arrangements as a kind of blackmail. They essentially did this with Germany and energy imports, so on and so forth. I never had a whole lot of faith that these agreements would be recognized in the long term. I think Russians agreed to do it as long as they felt that there was something for them to gain. I suspect that they don't see that now. They've, of course, said that there is no relationship between the bombing of the Kerch Strait Bridge and pulling out of this agreement and so on and so forth. It's hard to know their calculus there. I think any more direct American involvement accompanying merchant marine ships is another opportunity for direct, conflict between Russia and the United States, and that's disturbing, and that would be incredibly dangerous. Yeah.
Let's thank Dr. Law.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks so much to the Military Committee for once again getting us a top-notch speaker. In appreciation of your time today, we're making a donation to the Community Food Bank of Alabama. I want to assure our members that we tasted all of Dr. Law's food before he ate today. I feel fine. And so I think he's safe, at least for the time being. Please join us for our next meeting, Tuesday, July 25th, for a fireside chat with Cynthia Crutchfield, CEO of Innovate Alabama, and Kawanian Greg Barker, President of the Economic Development Partnership of Alabama. We'll learn more about their efforts to propel Alabama as a leading hub of innovation. Have a great week. And if you can, please do remember to vote today. The meeting is adjourned.
Jacob,
Yep.
can we get a photo with you?